is there really a laptop that is in front of me that I'm looking at? Or, in other words, is there actually an external object that is a laptop, right, external to the impressions in my consciousness of the idea that I have formed in my consciousness of the laptop in front of me? Or again, another way of putting this, is there actually an external object that is the laptop of which my idea that there is a laptop in front of me is derived or originated? So in this lecture video, we're going to be considering that very question. We're going to be looking at Yogacara and what's sometimes known as the idealism of Yogacara, or impressions only argument or view of Yogacara. So Yogacara is actually a school of Buddhist philosophy that is really started by Vasubandhu. Now, Vasubandhu was actually also an Abhidharma or Sautrantika Buddhist philosopher. He wrote a very famous treatise, the Abhidharma Kosha, outlining and defending the views of Abhidharma. But at some point in his life, he had a change, and he began criticizing Abhidharma's metaphysics and epistemology. And so what we're going to look at in this lecture video is his criticism of the Abhidharma epistemology, or the Sautrantika epistemology, and we're going to see his argument for why actually there are impressions only, and we don't have knowledge of external, there's no basis to claim that there are external objects out in the world. We simply do not have knowledge of these external objects. So there is the epistemological view of direct realism. So it says the knowledge that we acquire is derived directly from experience of the external object, that the ideas we form correspond to the external objects that we actually have direct apprehension of in our waking experience. So because we have experiences when we're asleep as well, right? So this is specifically about being awake. So for example, I have this coffee mug in front of me, and Nyaya, a proponent of direct realism, would say, I have the conscious judgment that there is this mug in front of me because that judgment is derived directly from the experience of the mug exactly as it is itself. Now, Sautrantika, or the Abhidharma school of Buddhism, they were indirect realists. So they would say that what we are directly aware of in our waking sensory experience, like being aware of this mug, is the mental image that resembles the external physical object. So they would say that it is not the case that I'm directly, my idea is directly a result of, the experience of the mug as it is, but instead I infer from my sense contact, right, with the mug. The mind then constructs based on those kind of impressions, you might say, or the sensory experience of these objects, right? Because when I perceive an object, I'm taking in sense data, but the mind has to kind of construct that in a way that is a representation of what it is that the senses are in contact with. So in that way, right, it's still saying that my knowledge, or the idea of this mug in front of me, that knowledge is derived from the actual external object itself. It's derived indirectly. So because our mental image is usually the result of sense contact, because sometimes as well we can have a mental image that, again, is the case like when we're sleeping. There's a heavy focus on influence on Sautrantika epistemology. Now the question that Vasubandhu wants to ask is, are we justified in making such an inference? So we're largely going to focus actually on Sautrantika and Abhidharma metaphysics and epistemology here in Vasubandhu's critique and argument for the Yogacara impressions-only view. So he wants to ask, okay, the Abhidharmas, they say we're indirectly aware of things because we make a certain kind of inference, or we reason on the basis of sensory impressions. And Vasubandhu is going to question that and say, how can we be so sure? Or how does that make sense that we're able to make inferences in this way? So Vasubandhu is going to ask, if someone has ophthalmia, which causes them to see as if fishnets were in front of their eyes, are there really fishnets in front of their eyes? Or if someone has jaundice and a white ball presents itself as yellow, so let's say there's a white ball in front of them, this external object of a white ball, and yet they're viewing it as yellow, is there really a yellow ball in front of their eyes? Now, the reason Vasubandhu asks these questions is he wants to say, look, there are ways in which we have to admit our perception or our judgment of objects is not influenced by those objects themselves. So it can't be the case that our perception of the object is direct. Now, how then do we come to make that judgment that this ball is actually yellow or there are fishnets in front of my eyes? And what he's going to say is we're not actually justified in making that judgment, that that external object is really there. That the whole world of sensory experience is actually impressions only. As he says, this is all appearance only, for even non-existent objects are presented to us, as, for instance, a person with faulty vision sees unreal hair, etc. So, what he's saying is that our the ideas that we form, that we think are representations of the external objects from which then those ideas are derived, even if we want to say, well, I have this sensory, when I'm holding the mug, right, and I hit the mug or whatever, I can feel the mug, right, so I have this sensation. And he's going to say, where does that sensation occur? Does it occur in your finger? Or when you're aware of that sensation, does it occur in the mind? Or is there an impression only of the object? So let's look at the actual argument that he lays out for the impressions only view. So the first premise of his argument is that all awareness of things occurs in the transformation of consciousness. He says, thought consciousness always manifests except in the realm of no thought. So as long as there is thought, there is some kind of consciousness. So what he's saying here is, again, if I go and I kick a rock and I say, see, there has to be this external object that is a rock that then my foot as an external object as well as a corporeal body hit, that rock has to actually exist because I feel it when I hit the rock, and if I kick the rock hard enough, it's going to hurt. That has to be proof of the existence of this rock as an external object, right? But his point here is that the place where that sensation actually occurs, or the awareness, right, of the feeling of the rock, it doesn't occur in the foot, it occurs in the mind, it occurs in consciousness. All of our feelings, right, when I touch my hand, when I hear, then the sensation has an awareness of an indeterminate thing, whatever it may be. It does not occur actually in my ear. It does not occur in my hands. It occurs in the mind. The mind is always the place where impressions occur, where we are aware of sensations. It is never in the sensory contact themselves, right? So we can't rely on just merely seeing things or touching things or tasting things, etc., as proof that we are touching or being aware of external objects that actually exist apart from, separate from the mind, because all of those sensations occur in the mind alone. Otherwise, we would never be aware of them. We would have no impressions of them. So the second premise, consciousness is discrimination and interpretation. So this means that consciousness is a means of conceptualizing something. He says, this transformation of consciousness is conceptualization. So, if you remember, there's the view that a person is potentially made up of the skandhas, right? You have feeling, a corporeal body, consciousness, judgment, volition. And what Vasubandhu is saying here is that, so we might want to say, well, part of ourself is actually the corporeal body, of which then, like my hand, where I touch something and I feel it. But notice, based on the first premise, he put this idea of the corporeal body under conceptual analysis, and it failed to hold up, because we found it is not the corporeal body that feels. It is the mind. And so therefore, feeling is a product of the mind. Will is a product of the mind. Consciousness is a product of the mind. Or they're all just conscious impressions, we actually might say. And so what he's saying here is, all the things that we are aware of in our consciousness are just conceptualizations created by consciousness. That what this means is, if, again, going back to the distinction between conventional and ultimate truth, right? The idea is something is conventionally true if it works, but something is ultimately true if it holds up under conceptual analysis. And his point here is that the only thing that holds up under conceptual analysis is that there are conscious impressions. But the skandhas by themselves, for example, don't hold up under conceptual analysis. They all are incoherent in some way as external things existing apart from the mind. So, back to premise 1. All awareness of things occurs in the transformation of consciousness. Premise 2, consciousness is discrimination and interpretation. So, all of our awareness of things actually occurs in the mind, and they are conceptions. Conceptions, notice, cannot be ultimately true things. All conceptions are things that are useful. So, that means all of the things created by the mind are useful because, or they're created because they're useful for the mind, for consciousness. So, his conclusion, nothing exists other than mental things or impressions only. As he says, what is conceptualized does not exist. Thus, everything is projection only. So, all we are justified in our the knowledge we form in the formation of ideas, right? We want to say, well, no, the ideas are an inference of a perception of the externally, real things that exist in the world. And Vasubandhu's point here is that, well, actually, all those conceptions are conceptions created by the mind, and we are never aware outside of the mind of those things themselves. They are always impressions in the mind. So all those things that you see are projections of the mind only. So all that exists are impressions, nothing else. The mind, actually, we'll see, doesn't exist. It is only conscious impressions that exist, but never a distinct thing that is the mind. Because, of course, Vasubandhu, all Buddhists say, there's no such thing as the self. So there couldn't be a single subsisting mind over time either. They're just conscious impressions that exist. Now, all Buddhists, of course, are focused on enlightenment, right? The point of Buddhism is to overcome suffering and enable enlightenment. So how does this kind of idealism or impressions-only view of Yogacara, how does this enable enlightenment? And Vasubandhu's argument is that if everything is impressions only, then the path to overcome grasping or becoming attached to things is clear. Because there's nothing to become attached to in the external world, because it's all just manifestations of consciousness, or they're all just conscious manifestations. He says, the imaginary is without self by definition. The other dependent does not exist by itself. The third is no self-nature, that is, the complete realized nature of all phenomena, which is thusness, since it is always already thus projection only. As long as consciousness does not rest in projection only, the tendencies of grasping self and other will not cease. By conceiving what you put before you to be projection only, you do not rest in just this. When consciousness does not perceive any object, then it rests in projection only. When there is nothing to grasp, there is no grasping. And when there's nothing, right, think about that. When there are no external objects to hold on to, there is no holding on to. There is no attachment. There is no desiring. Without conception, this is the supramundane awareness. The overturning of the root, the ending of the two barriers. So if there are impressions only, then there is nothing external in the world to hold on to. Then it becomes clear that one can achieve enlightenment by realizing that all of our ideas are conscious manifestations and not representations of external things in the world that we should, in a sense, hold on to, whether physically or conceptually. So, for the rest of this, I want to consider, or look at objections that Vasubandhu considers and see his responses. So this first objection is that if appearances do not arise from external objects, then there is no reason why appearances should arise at particular times and places, or why they should be produced across different minds, or why objects of such appearances should have causal efficacy. So, for example, why don't I see red at random times, or an elephant at other random times, instead of when it seems there is some causal explanation, like there's an elephant in front of me, or there's a red object in front of me? Now, there is, right, in that case of ophthalmia that Vasubandhu mentioned, there is an external explanation for the cause of ophthalmia, which is this condition in the eye, right? And there's a causal explanation for jaundice as well, which seems to make no sense of impressions only. Because both these things are to say, well, look, there's these physical external reasons why the mind perceives those things or perceives in that way. So how can Vasubandhu respond to this? He says, well, if all is impressions only, there's still causal explanation. This is not to say that we're kind of in this imaginary, spiritual, ideal world of just consciousness and things just come and appear at random, like a kind of, water just floating around or whatever, right? There's still causality in conscious impressions. Two quotes, I think, get at this. First, he says, the production of appearances at particular times and places is established just in the case of dreams. So even in dreams, when we have to admit there is impressions-only experience, there's still a kind of causal explanation, even if sometimes it may seem extremely weird. There's still a reason why in a dream you look at someone and you talk to them, or you walk around and so on, right? So there's still a kind of explanation for how events in dreams play out. Even if we want to say, well, some of this is the subconscious or unconscious manifesting itself, these are still actually aspects of conscious experience, even if conscious past experience that are residual, that have an impact on our current conscious awareness. The second quote, he says, the causal efficacy of objects of appearances is established just as in the case of nocturnal emissions. So what is he saying here in the case of nocturnal emissions? What does he mean? So in this case, he's saying that it can be the case that impressions only, like in the case of dreams, can actually influence what we might consider to be the external world. By nocturnal emissions, he means by sperm ejaculating, actually. That one can have dreams or whatever that cause the external body actually to, supposing there is an external body, which he would just deny, that would cause the external body to be causally affected by our impressions only. So we have a clear example as to how conscious impressions influence other conscious impressions, and how, if it is the case that there is an external world, conscious impressions can also influence the external world. So, how do we explain the object presented by appearances then? Because there is an explanation that is seen in Abhidharma metaphysics. There's an explanation for how, if there are no wholes, there are only parts, there are these ultimately small parts called dharmas, right? That are the source of all things. Vasubandhu is going to criticize that account of external objects. He's going to consider three options for how we explain the object presented by appearances, and he's going to reject all three of them. The first option, the external basis of sensory cognition, such as color, can be simple like the part possessing form. So this is something that Abhidharma claimed, that colors can be simple things. They can be dharmas, these ultimately simple things. And that can explain why, when we have a conscious impression of the color red, it's because we were in contact with the external dharma that is ultimately simple of the color red. Vasubandhu's response is going to be, the object of awareness, like the color red, cannot be simple because we're actually never aware of an object without also being aware of its parts. So we're never actually aware of, for example, dharmas, in the same way that we're never aware of atoms or protons or neutrons. All these things are so small, the mind is never in contact or never conceptualizes those things directly from, or even therefore indirectly from our sensory experiences, because those things are so small. Our sensations are not, they're not sensitive enough to things that are ultimately simple. They have to be a collection of parts, such that then, right, the sensation comes or is able to be manifest due to becoming in contact with the parts. So if we were going to say the external basis of sensory cognition, such as color, for example, the awareness of color is based on the external object, or the perceiving an object, an external object that possesses the color red, that this is done because it's simple, right? Vasubandhu is saying that doesn't make sense because we're never aware, actually, we never come into contact with simples. The second option, the external basis of sensory cognition, such as color, can be a plurality of atoms. That perhaps color is just a manifestation of a plurality of ultimately small things. Vasubandhu's response is going to be that, well, neither can a plurality of atoms be the object of awareness, because again, we're never aware of an individual atom. So maybe they're not the ultimately simple things, but they're a collection of the ultimately simple things that form an atom. But atoms are still too small. So this can't explain it either. Option 3 for how we can potentially explain the object presented by our appearances. The external basis of sensory cognition, such as color, can be a unified collection of atoms which are conjoined to each other. So now, right, notice we're kind of just getting bigger and bigger here. But again, Vasubandhu says, nor can a unified collection of atoms be the object of awareness, because the status of an atom as a simple substance is not established. Because remember, the whole point of this is that, well, for Abhidharma metaphysics, there are no wholes. There are no, atoms of like the color red that actually exist. They're just dharmas, which are momentary, and they're ultimately small simples, right? Non-complex, no parts, just simple things. And so the Abhidharmas then, to make sense of how we can ever be aware of those ultimately simple things, they keep having to appeal to, well, maybe there's enough simple things that combine together to form something. But then that would contradict the idea that there can actually be whole, or there can actually, there can't be wholes that are a collection of parts, because the wholes are just a conceptual fiction. Right? So as Vasubandhu here says, unified collections of atoms cannot be established by appeal to the conjoining of atoms, because atoms have no parts. So it turns out the Abhidharma attempt to make sense of how there is no self, how there are no wholes, can't actually explain how we become aware of external objects at all. So Vasubandhu says, appeal to externally existing atoms that contain the essence of each thing observed does not explain the causal relations between atoms, the essence, and the changing perception of them. So Abhidharma metaphysics actually can explain how it is that there are external objects, or their epistemology can explain how there are external objects at all that we could be aware of. As he says, if it were simple, gradual traversal wouldn't be possible, nor would simultaneous perception and non-perception of the same object with respect to different parts be possible. Nor could separate objects reside at different places, nor would very small objects be imperceptible. A further objection. Ideas cannot just be thought without first having directly perceived the thing of which it is an idea. That we know this as kids, it seems like. We have to be taught things first, or shown things. Like, for example, if you have a ball, okay? And you give a child a ball. They've never seen this ball before. It turns out it's a rubber ball. They drop the ball on the ground and it bounces. So then you give them a cotton ball. Well, based on that first experience with the ball, right, they're likely to think, well, this also is going to bounce when I drop it. But of course, when they drop the cotton ball, it's not going to bounce. So it seems like the idea, like, oh, balls bounce, would be derived directly from the perception of the actual external object itself over time. Right? So we have to be introduced to the external object first before we can have a thought about it. Vasubandhu's response to this is that all objects are momentary. Nothing is permanent. So there's no reason one cannot fall into an infinite regression in trying to find the originary external object perceived. So if all objects are momentary, if we want to say, right, if we want to accept this, Buddhist doctrine that all things are impermanent, there's nothing that subsists permanently over time, then we would actually fall into an infinite regression trying to chase down where was the original contact with that external object that existed momentarily, right? Well, there would be no real experience of that object because objects are causally conditioned such that they never really subsist as things that we feel like intuitively we can just grasp and hold on to over time, like again this mug. But this mug really is not something that I perceive and grasp over time as a singular thing. It is always produced by new sensory impressions, right? New sensory impressions are always being produced, which are of this mug. But it is not the mug that subsists over time that then I form this permanent idea of the mug. So as Vasubandhu says, it has already been said that appearances present objects as if they were real. The same goes for recollection. The absence of objects in dreams isn't recognized unless one is awake. So it's never actually until there's a disconnect in my conscious impressions that I realize that something isn't holding up, and my conscious impressions hold up. But it's never that, the external object isn't there, and that's why my conscious impression is altered. It's always because there's some connection between the conscious impressions in their causal manifestations. Another objection. If appearances are produced within sentient beings' own minds and not from external objects, then how can anyone ever be responsible for harm committed? So if I call someone else names and I hurt their feelings, where there's never a real me that exists in the external world such that my voice could reach the mind of the other person and that other person's feelings would be hurt, because there's just conscious impressions. Vasubandhu's response is that appearances are mutually constrained by one another's minds, or actually we could just say that conscious impressions are constrained by other conscious impressions. So one would still be responsible for harm committed, or there would still be a source of the harm. this is actually, Vasubandhu's point is, it's easier actually to make sense of the causal relations between things if all things are just conscious impressions, because we can say how one thought influences another thought, because they're of the same metaphysical substance. But if you want to say that physical things can influence mental things, and mental things can influence mental things, well, if they're distinct metaphysical substances, how do you explain how they interact? How do you explain how there's a causal relation between those things? So it's actually quite easy, Vasubandhu is saying, to explain how someone can, or some set of conscious impressions can be responsible for influencing other conscious impressions. As he says, appearances are mutually constrained in virtue of their dominance over one another. In dreams, the mind languishes in a state of torpor. That is why the fruits of acts are different in the two states of waking and sleeping consciousness, because the kinds of conscious impressions are different, but they're still only conscious impressions. The final objection we'll look at: if all is merely appearance or impressions only, then how do minds become aware of other minds? How is it that you can become aware of me speaking to you right now that there is an Austin? Now, this is actually an easy response for Vasubandhu. This question is mistaken, because the mind is an illusion, right? There are impressions only. There actually is no mind that is Austin's mind. There is no mind that is your mind. There are just conscious impressions that exist, that interact and causally affect each other. So there are no minds that are aware of things. There are actually only conscious impressions. So perhaps this is yet another reason why one adopting the Yogacara view would be better able to achieve enlightenment, because there's actually less reason to become attached to things like my own mind, because there are only just conscious impressions, or there are impressions only.